Today's story was written by Reddit user Moonfly71. Humans are a selfish species, you say? Sounds like you've been listening to humans tell their stories then. Most of all their stories and histories have at least some cautionary tale about how they can't be trusted. How, no matter what, humans are out for themselves. Kind of sad, really. Don't pay much attention to them. They're just trying to be helpful, in their own strange way. They aren't entirely wrong. Humans can be some of the most selfish creatures you've ever met. But that's by individual, the same as any other species, really. Their government can be vicious and crude, and before they united, they fought many wars against each other over petty resources and feuds spurred by the blind ambition of a few. So, in a way, I suppose humans are selfish creatures at heart. They're also the most selfless beings in the galaxy, but the stories about that aren't something humans are going to tell you, and if they did, they'll be heavily altered into some kind of cautionary tale or other. Silly humans, as if we could forget. Take the Zathrek War, about 100 to 150 Earth years or so ago. The Zathrek are a brutal reptilian race, and back then, their empire spanned about 30 systems. Their might was undisputed, their forces so impressive, and the systems they took so insignificant that the Galactic Council decided it was better to let them be than risk a costly war with them over such paltry offences. This continued for a few decades. Then the Zathrek began to make aggressive overtures towards the Grassani. The Grassani are a mostly non-aggressive species, as you probably know. Brilliant bioengineers, but they use their knowledge to create better livestock and other helpful plant and animal mutations. They controlled about half a dozen planets, barely a quarter of their system, and maintained a small but mostly profitable trade with a few other races. One of their most profitable trade partners were the humans. Still relatively new to the galactic stage, already they were recognised the galaxy over for their creativity and ingenuity, if not their technological superiority. Humans may not invent the most amazing and effective technology, but the galaxy had already seen that they could utilise and improve upon existing tech in a way no other species could. I don't quite know why the humans were the best customers of the Grassani. At the beginning of their hyper-travel, when they were still inexperienced, the Grassani's bioengineers were hired to help adapt the human plants and livestock to thrive better in hostile environments. But by the time 2 decades had passed, humans could more than carry out the task themselves for much cheaper. Not with the same artistic and masterful quality as the Grassani, but surely more than was necessary to be successful. And yet still, the humans were the Grassani's greatest customers. The human government even subsidised the Grassani imports, making them cheaper than human-grown products. And yet no more than the standard human complaining came from the private bioengineering sector, which, let me tell you, is strange indeed for humanity. Anyways, the Zathrek began their invasions like they always did back then. First, they colonised the closest neutral moons they could without violating private space. The first 3 times they did this, their opponents might have been surprised. But by now the Grassani and every other race knew it was the beginning of the end for the peaceful bioengineers. While you might think that a species that dabbled with DNA on a daily basis would have some terrifying beasts hidden away for defense, the Grassani did not. They were simply inquisitive, creative beings. They never harmed anyone and had a simple philosophy of peace. They had no valuable resources that anyone would want, and were struck with terror and surprise when the Zathrek began to slowly encroach on their territory. They knew it was the end. They decided to fight anyway, since their people would be killed or taken as slaves by the Zathrek, in a cruel application of that species' survival of the fittest, life philosophy, and despicable religion. The poor small creatures had few weapons, and fewer trained soldiers, and a pitiful number of either of those could actually hurt the weakest of Zathrak shock troops, let alone kill one. The Zathrak landed their first assault ships on the outlying Grisani stations about 3 cycles after they built combat outposts on those outlying moons. Their forces were an overwhelming amount of overkill, and they swept through the first few stations like they were paper. The whole endeavour took about 10 Grisani outposts in roughly 3 brutal weeks. The Grisani were shaking on their home planets, and sent a begging plea to be allowed to surrender to the Zathrak. Their only reply was, "Fight as well as you can, and pray you don't embarrass those who are already dead. You'll be able to receive their judgment soon." It was in those first 3 weeks that the Zathrak made the mistake that would result in their loss of the war, and their entire empire. Because during their 7th boarding of a Grisani station, a single human ship piloted by their reporters captured every single minute of the brutal slaughter caused by the Zathrak warlust. They also caught the futile attempt to stem the inevitable by the small underarm force of Grisani. These humans caught every second of the battle, both inside and out, using non-combat camera drones, largely ignored by the Zathrak as non-dangerous. And though they did indeed lack any weapon systems, the Zathrak could not have been more wrong. I'm sure the Zathrak still curse the names of those poor commanders who gave the orders to not waste fire on their silly human toys. Not that anyone could blame them. No one could have predicted what was about to happen. Those drones beamed their footage directly to the human information stream called the Internet. The crew of reporters were there to observe the strangely beautiful glowing algae the Grisani had released into local asteroid belts for fun, because apparently it created colours in the human's visible spectrum that they had never seen before. Instead, the ship managed to catch the wholesale slaughter of the poor geneticists. The results were astounding. The humans were outraged. They saw these poor creatures, the Grisani, fighting against insurmountable odds with no way of success, and their hearts went out to those brave little guys. Near the end of those 3 terrifying weeks, the Grisani elected council got an astounding message from their single human ambassador, the same ambassador who had politely refused to leave when he was informed of the threat to their system, and offered a chance to escape by his hosts. The message was simple. The humans would be sending aid so that the Grisani could, in the words of the ambassador, not fall back on any necessary production because of these dumbass lizards. The Grisani gratefully accepted the aid and prepared their shipyards and docks to receive what they assumed would be ships full of food supplies, backup generators, and maybe a few volunteer aid workers. Instead, when the human vessels appeared, they were not simple cargo freighters carrying food and supplies. They were dreadnoughts, 52 of them, carrying fleets of short-range fighters, heavy assault vehicles, and weapons, approximately 500 individual types of assorted arms and armour, and over 100 battalions of fully prepared human stock troops trained in urban warfare. The Grisani were, at first, fearful. They did not have a treaty of any sort beyond the standard one provided by membership in the Galactic Council, and certainly no defense agreement of any kind. Could the humans be here to conquer while the Grisani were weak? No, the humans said they were here to help. Their engineers began to fortify Grisani defences and alter evacuation plans. Their troops bolstered the Grisani forces in waves. Their generals, more experienced than the Grisani, began to aid them in the creation of a solid defence. Even privately owned human scrap vessels pitched in, pulling the bodies of the dead Grisani out of the wrecked space stations. working behind enemy lines at constant risk, just so that the Grisani could bury their dead. So, as the Zathrak landed on the first Grisani world, they found not a series of helpless cities with pitiful forces, but anti-spacecraft artillery and a few vessels from the human fleet that hit the ships as they tried to land, harassing and haranguing the Zathrak, but not able to stop their descent entirely. Once on the ground, while a bit confused, the Zathrak were more than prepared, they thought. The Grisani may have had a little help, and a few more ships than expected, but they were still the weak and cowardly beings they had been 3 weeks ago. The Zathrak kept thinking this, even as they lost dozens of men to the mines that the human engineers, aided by newly trained Grisani, had laid in every inch of the ground. When the Zathrak troops finally pierced through the minefields by sheer numbers, they found not screaming helpless civilians, but cities empty of everything but soldiers and fortifications. The humans, aided by the few Grisani troops, waged guerrilla warfare on the planet. They blew entire buildings to drop them on the Zathrak forces. They filled the narrow alleys with flames from human plasma throwers, hit the Zathrak whenever they stopped to sleep, and waylaid them at every turn. It took 5 months of fighting, but the Zathrak finally secured enough of the planet that they felt they could continue onward, turning to the next planet in the line of Grisani space. They found what the united humans and Grisani had done during those 5 months that they had bought. The humans, you see, didn't just come to help the Grisani. They'd come to do something better than that. They'd come to teach the Grisani to help themselves. Humans trained the Grisani in warfare, churning out a larger Grisani military than had ever existed. They showed them how to utilize all 4 of their manipulating appendages and thick colour-changing fur to shoot faster than repeating rifles, and blend in with their environment. But they didn't stop there. The humans encouraged the Grisani to fall back on their greatest strength: genetics. So it was that when the Zathrak attempted to land on the second Grisani world, they fought not just human dreadnought and fighters, but great flying beasts that could live in the void of space. These giant reptilian snake-like things were the size of a decent transport vessel, and they could become invisible. They'd been genetically modified to reflect no light when they did not want to, be undetectable in UV scanners, and have no body heat. They'd even rendered their electromagnetic fields barely noticeable. The things were based on some human myth that had fascinated the Grisani scientists who had heard it, and when the humans told them they should create creatures for battle, it was the first thing that came to mind. These dragons exhaled plasma and poison and acid. Surviving an assault by one of these is only possible when your shields are up to deflect their blasts, and when they're working, you're perfectly safe. But that's where the Grisani's second murder beast came in. Insects that release a localized EMP field, fired onto ships using rockets with so little thrust and tech that it could pass through the shields. These things used stealth to make their way to the shield generators and crawled into every crack they could find. Usually 250 per missile, 10 missiles per ship. Finding and stopping every one of those millimetre-long bugs were nigh impossible. I won't tell you about every single horror the human-inspired Grisani unleashed. I'll tell you this though. By the end of the war, the Zathrak weren't sure who scared them more. The tiny four-armed furry beings that designed such horrors, or the skinny hairless bipeds who ripped through their forces, who didn't stop fighting until you put an entire magazine of plasma rounds into their armour. The tales they had of humans on what they call an adrenaline rush still haunt the nightmares of Zathrak children. Oh, and they didn't stop after they reconquered the Grisani worlds that were taken. At least the humans didn't. The Grisani were infinitely grateful to humanity, but were content to guard their borders with their dragons and tanglevines and sentient asteroids. Do not ask. And let bygones be bygones. The humans respected this, but pushed forward on their own anyways. Freeing the Grisani had taken about a year or two. The following incursion by the humans extended the war by 8 years, and it was very clear who was losing. It took the humans blowing a moon into the Zathrek homeworld for the scaly bastards to realise it was them though. By then, the message was clear to the rest of the galaxy though. The humans were scary, and you shouldn't piss them off. What wasn't clear though was why the humans were so pissed off. They didn't go on a rampage when the Dramaki invaded Karlsgrove 5 and 6 a few years before all this. Why did they care about the Grisani so much? They didn't actually need anything from the Grisani. They might have actually been better off doing all their genetics in-house. So why? What could possibly have made them come to the aid of these people? That's what the Grisani elders asked the human leaders when they signed their first protection pact after the war. The human leaders looked puzzled by the questions. Apparently, to every human in the galaxy, the answer was obvious. "You helped us," the humans said. "When we were shipping our food to every planet and outpost straight from Earth, it was you who offered us a cheap way to feed our outposts. When we couldn't pay, you took our credit. When we needed something custom made, you didn't complain. You were happy to help. Very few human colonies don't owe their lives to Grisani work. Why wouldn't we come help our greatest friends?" The Grisani were very surprised by this. Surely now the humans and Grisani were stalwart allies. Grisani and humans trusted each other more than any other species in the galaxy after the war, but not before. Before, the Grisani were simply doing regular business. The humans paid them standard rates and never failed to pay before their famine. And Galactic Federation regulations had fair rules about giving credit. The Grisani had been following the rules, nothing mighty or friendly. But to humans, that didn't matter. The Grisani products kept them alive. Too many humans had vivid memories of a 4-armed furry being arriving on the planet and magically fixing the food problem. It was only fair to give them good business, and to help them when they needed aid, at least in their eyes. It wasn't like the humans had bled alone on those streets. They said the Grisani had bled and died too. They'd just given them a little boost, and then taught the Zathrek why you shouldn't touch human friends. Basically the same as what the Grisani had done in their eyes. See, if you go back into human history, you'll see a number of wars where countries that had no treaty stuck their noses in to help one side or another, because they felt bad for them, or just wanted to see the little guy win. The humans say this is greedy, selfish. They need to leave conflicts that aren't theirs alone, not try to profit or make themselves look better. The Grisani don't say that though, or the Volcat when the humans helped them during the Cirrus Plague a few years later, or the Gurand when the humans helped end their civil war via their diplomats. Humans are just selfless like that. They stick their noses in your business, and they don't like it when they see conflict or problems. I think that their warnings that they're selfish at heart are born from their selflessness. Humans have done things that they aren't proud of over the years, things that are selfish in nature, and they want to make sure that no one gets burned or caught by surprise by what they fear is inevitable. But warning people of their faults at the detriment of popular opinion sounds pretty selfless to me. Not that it works very well. They don't get away with it much nowadays. See, everyone hires humans to build their stuff, and they always insist on hiring Grisani geneticists for any bio work, since humans don't trust anybody else, and you know most crap needs at least a bit of that nowadays. Thing is, The Grisani don't let them get away with their self-deprecating stories, as much as they could if they were alone. Surprised your human friend managed to get a few of his off? Grisani must have been working late that night.